In the early 1940s, the Nazis controlled Paris, but even then they were terrified of a depraved maniac whose body count might have been as high as 150. The cops wanted him. The Nazis really wanted him, but this highly educated psychopath wasn't so easy to catch. This is the story of a man who became known as Dr. Satan, and it's arguably one of the most messed up tales we've ever told. Let's start at the beginning. 1940 was a bad time for most Parisians. Before those German tanks made their way into the city, around 2 million residents of Paris had already moved out. For those left behind and who understood the perils of Nazism, it was a depressing time. Their bones chilled as they watched the swastika flag fly above the Arc de Triomphe. Some of these were people who'd be spied on by the Gestapo and worse, interrogated and possibly killed. It was a time of great fear and paranoia, so the last thing anyone needed was a serial killer to add to their woes. A man that left decapitated heads and other body parts for the cops to find. Nonetheless, Dr. Satan was a hero to many, albeit folks who were continually fooled by him. As for the Nazis, it would be reasonable to say that the evil doctor was always one step ahead of them. His real name was Marcel Petiot. How he ever became a doctor boggles the mind, which is something we'll think you'll agree with after you hear about his strange life from childhood to adulthood. He was born in the French city of Auxerre on January 17, 1897, and he was a delinquent at a young age. At age 11, he brought a gun to school and used it to threaten a girl. He got involved with theft, smashed up public property, and he did terrible things to small animals. It said he also put on a kind of circus act one time in school, standing against a locked door in class and throwing knives at the other students. It's not surprising then that he was deemed mentally ill by child psychiatrists. According to the book Death in the City of Light, the serial killer of Nazi-occupied Paris, he got expelled from school a few times as a teenager and so was evaluated by professionals, who said this kid is just not right in the head. His parents, of course, were very concerned, telling doctors that he wet the bed and had occasional convulsive fits. They were also a bit worried about his constant sleepwalking. If you were to ask an expert now, they might assume this kid at some point had a serious head injury, and that's what caused all the problems. A psychiatrist in 1914 seemed to suggest that his frontal lobes weren't working right, stating that he was an abnormal youth who didn't take responsibility for his acts. As you'll see, nothing really changed when he became an adult. Still, he ended up at a special Paris academy, and later in 1916, when he was 19 years old, he went to fight for the French army in the trenches of World War I. What could possibly go wrong? A kid with mental health problems and a proclivity for violence being hired to murder people. Physicians among the French forces said what others had said before. Petiot had some serious mental health issues. The kid wasn't fit to fight. He was already walking close to the edges of sanity when he was gassed and wounded in battle, after which it said he had a complete breakdown. At first, he was sent to homes where he could be looked after properly, but then he took up the bad habit of stealing morphine and other supplies, including people's personal stuff and their letters and photos from loved ones. For that, he got some jail time, but after being professionally diagnosed with more than one mental illness, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. It was those diagnoses that kept him out of prison, with doctors saying he wasn't a criminal but mentally ill. One psychiatrist wrote in a report that he suffered from mental disequilibrium, neurasthenia, mental depression, melancholia, obsessions, and phobias. If you're wondering what neurasthenia means, it's basically a term for being persistently mentally disturbed. After 3 weeks' leave, he went back to the army. During his stint, he complained of headaches and blackouts, memory loss, and sleepwalking. At first, he was let go from the forces and given a 40% disability pension, but then after review got 100% pension. He was then sent to the asylum, a place he'd one day say he was a doctor, not a patient. In 1919, he was finally released from that institution. The war was over, he was 22 years old. You could say it was time for a new beginning. Although the doctors that had seen this young man and studied his temperament said it was important that he was kept under continuous surveillance. That didn't happen. Being mentally ill or having a personality disorder just doesn't necessarily mean a person can't do well in life. Look at the other lives of many serial killers that you all know well. Some of them excelled in certain areas, and while they were busy cutting up victims, they held down decent jobs, and some had a wife and children at home who loved them dearly. So it was that Monsieur Petiot joined an accelerated medical education program for war veterans, and he absolutely nailed the exams. He landed an internship at a hospital, and by the time December 1921 rolled around, he could proudly say he was the owner of a medical degree. He then set up a practice in his town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, a lovely little place in the Burgundy region, and a place that would feel the wrath of Petiot's violence. Now he was a professional, but his mental health issues were still there. He'd even got arrested for stealing at one point, but he kept his job. Petiot very likely had a touch of the psychopath in him. We say that for various reasons, with one being that he was very cunning and absolutely without a conscience. He needed more patience, so he went about saying he was one of the best doctors in town. He printed flyers that said so. One of them said, "Dr. Petiot is young, and only a young doctor can keep up to date on the latest methods born of a progress which marches with giant strides. This is why intelligent patients have confidence in him. Dr. Petiot treats but does not exploit his patients." That could not have been further from the truth. He charmed his way into getting a long list of patients who he enrolled in a government program, thereby ensuring he got paid once by them and once by the government. It said someone would come to his practice with a regular kind of illness and he'd say, "Here's some morphine, that should fix it." No doubt it helped, but opiates are generally not the first line of treatment for a bad cold or a bout of tonsillitis. One time, the recipient of his morphine was just a kid, and the kid almost died from an overdose. When a pharmacist told Petiot that in no way should he be giving opiates to children for minor problems, he replied, "What difference does it make to you anyway? Isn't it better to do away with this kid who's not doing anything in the world but pestering his mother?" Now, we should say right here that when Baer first started marketing heroin in the late 19th century, one of its uses was to give kids help with their coughs. Heroin is basically strong morphine. It worked, because the drug tends to work in many ways, but it also was highly addictive and dangerous as hell. So while Petiot might have had a point about morphine being an excellent product to shut up talkative kids, he shouldn't have been doing what he was doing. Those frontal lobes, it seems, were still not doing their job and helping this man think about the consequences of his actions. He spent most of his time alone, only coming out to drive his sports car and occasionally smashing it into other cars. It was at this time in his life that he stole from his brother Marcel and was kicked out of his rented accommodation for theft. In 1922, the Commission de Réforme told him that he had to undergo a new examination regarding his disability pension. A doctor later said his tongue was badly injured because he was always biting it during his convulsions. He added that Petiot had an indifference about his life and the way it was going. How he kept his job as a doctor beggars belief, and more so because he was even allowed to claim 50% of his disability pension. Well, guess it was the 1920s, you could get away with such things back then. He began an affair with the daughter of one of his patients, a young woman named Louise Delaveau. After a few months, she disappeared. Neighbors of Petiot told the cops that they'd seen him putting what looked like a really heavy package into the back of his car. The police looked into this but concluded that Delaveau had probably just skipped town. It was certainly a strange case though, seeing that at the time Delaveau's parents' home was broken into and burned to the ground. Later, something that looked like the trunk Petiot had stuffed into the back of his car that day was pulled out of a river in the town. Inside it was the badly decomposed remains of a young woman. But this being the 1920s, the cops didn't have ways of properly identifying the body. Undoubtedly, this was his first murder, although it was never proven. If this story couldn't get any crazier, and we promise you it's going to go off the rails, Petiot decided that he wanted to be the town mayor. Being the trusted town doctor, he actually won the mayorship, but only after he paid some guy to spoil his opponent's speech when the two were debating. At one point, just after he finished his own speech, the town lights all went out and a bunch of fires were started. That was the work of Petiot's man, and when the votes were counted, it was revealed he'd won by a landslide. During his time as mayor, he got busy stealing again, and among other things, he took a drum from the town band and a stone cross that he didn't like much. When he was accused of this, he said he was the best mayor the town had ever had, and those accusations were just his political enemies reeling with envy and trying to taint his good name. In 1927, age 30, he married a 23-year-old woman named Georgette Lablais. You probably wouldn't be too surprised to hear that she was the daughter of a wealthy landowner in the region. They had a kid together, Gerhard, and things were looking up. Even so, Petiot was accused of stealing oil from the town's railroad depot. He was fined 200 francs and sentenced to 3 months in prison, but he managed to get that decision reversed. In 1930, there was a huge fire at the house of a dairy unionist named Armand de Bouve. When the flames were finally out, his wife was found inside, having been beaten to death with what cops said was a blunt instrument. 20,000 francs were missing too, and police found footprints leading from the house back to the nearby town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. On top of that, there were rumors going around that the dead woman had been the mistress of none other than Monsieur Petiot. He'd even been seen near her home on the night of the fire. The witness who'd seen Petiot was Monsieur Fisco. He told the police that he would testify to that in court. But with not many doctors around, he had no choice but to visit Petiot's practice when his rheumatism was acting up. Fisco was given an injection, and 3 hours later, he was dead. Petiot said the man had an aneurysm. You're probably now seeing why he was nicknamed Dr. Satan, but we're just getting into the story. A few years later, all those complaints about him came to the fore, and he was forced to resign as mayor. People were so fooled by the guy that the council resigned with him, saying what had happened was just unfair. In 1932, he got a job on the council himself, but a year later he lost the seat because it had been found that he was stealing electricity. The case went to court with the judge saying Pétion's defense was nothing but a fantasy. He was subsequently sentenced to 15 days in jail and handed a 300-franc fine. As usual, Pétion appealed the decision and later his jail time was suspended. In the end, he stayed out of jail and was only fined 100 francs. Still, that meant the end of his council seat and a bad reputation that was becoming harder to shake off. With his character now tarnished, he made the move to Paris, the city where his cruelty and criminality would soar to new heights. Pétion started what became a very popular practice on the Rue de Coumartin, using fake documents at times so that people thought he was the best doctor around for miles, handing out morphine for just about any condition or illness, which, as tends to happen with highly addictive drugs, had people queuing up every day to see him. He even had the audacity to counterfeit a document that claimed part of his work experience had been as an intern working at a certain mental health institution, although the truth was that he'd been a patient there, not part of the medical staff. He just changed the word interned to intern. As crazy as it sounds, he kept his job after being sent to a mental health facility for his stealing. Later, when he got out and was working again, he was given the médecin d'état civil so he could write death certificates. Now he could more easily knock people off. One of his victims was a 30-year-old woman named Raymonde Hans. She went to see Pétion about some painful abscess in her mouth, and it was decided that he'd surgically remove them. After the operation, she'd never again regained consciousness. He drove her home in that state, and she was pronounced dead a few hours later. Her mother, Madame Anna Coquille, said something just wasn't right here. Her daughter had been in good health despite the abscesses. She ordered an autopsy, and it was found that her daughter had been given a very high dose of morphine. This should have rung alarm bells, but after an investigation it was ruled that the woman had died of natural causes. Not long after, in 1936, Pétion was caught shoplifting, and then when a cop tried to arrest him, Pétion beat him up. It was after this event that the authorities started looking at him more seriously. He ended up in court again, this time crying his eyes out, saying he'd had one of his funny attacks. He told the court to look at his army record and the fact that he'd at times been mentally ill, and the court didn't charge him in the end, saying that instead he'd been hit with temporary insanity. Still, it pleased the court when they heard that Pétion's wife had arranged for him to spend some time in a sanatorium. Not long after he arrived there, he told doctors that he was actually in good shape mentally and he asked to be released. He said his lapse of madness was due to stress. He lied and said he'd been working on a machine for constipation, a device that literally sucked the poop out of people, and he said the stress of finishing the device had negatively affected his mental well-being. The main psychiatrist for the court wrote that Pétion was chronically imbalanced, but the judge concluded that Pétion was sane enough to go back into society. How very wrong he was. After his release at the beginning of 1937, he actually seemed to start adhering to the law, including taking a break from stealing. Still, his one big transgression was tax evasion, with him claiming he'd earned only about 10% of what he actually made. He went to court again for that, but again he turned on the waterworks, claiming he'd been driven to the crime because of poverty. And yet again, the psychopath walked out of court with a great big grin on his face. As you know, in 1939, war broke out, and in 1940, German tanks arrived in Paris. Marshal Philippe Pétain became the head of the Vichy government, and French life was about to change in many ways. For a lot of people, this was a distressing time, but for a psychopath, it afforded many new opportunities. One of Pétion's first moves was making fake medical certificates. You see, many French folks were told by the Nazis that they'd now be working for them, and that meant a kind of slave labor. It seems they could get out of this with a medical certificate, and Pétion was the man to go to for one of them. On face value, it looked as though he was on the side of the French resistance. He treated French people who'd been wounded or fallen ill in Germany, and through those people, he learned a lot about the movements of Nazis and the Gestapo that was busy trying to hunt resistance fighters. He helped spy on the Gestapo through something he called the Fly Talks Network. He then gave information to resistance fighters so they could assassinate members of the Gestapo. This is what he told people anyway. Maybe it sounds quite heroic to you, given what would have happened to Pétion if he'd been found out. The Nazis would very likely have tortured and killed him. But remember, he was a psycho, and because of this, he made up stories all the time to make it look like he was helping the resistance. He even told them he had some kind of super weapon that when used could kill a Nazi and make it look like death by natural causes. He told a big tale about working with some anti-fascist Spaniards in Paris, and he spun all kinds of lies about making bombs and booby traps with which he killed plenty of Nazis. All these stories only ever really happened inside his own head, but they were about to help him make lots of money. He started telling people, mainly Jews and resistance fighters, but even criminals, that he could get them safe passage out of France and to somewhere safe on another continent. All they had to do was hand him 25,000 francs. In 1941, he bought a house on Rue de Sueur and used it to hide these people before they were sent on one of his so-called underground railways to someplace like South America. Two of his customers were Joseph Rio Cruz and Adrian Estebetegui. These guys had been pimps, but what really irked the Nazis is that they committed an armed robbery while wearing Nazi uniforms. That was definitely a death sentence if they were caught. Petiot, now calling himself Dr. Eugène, told them no sweat. He could easily get them out of France. These two guys went to the house on Rue de Sueur, followed by their lovers and also another couple who were said to be a pimp and his prostitute, and presto, all 6 of these people did in fact disappear. But rather than spend time and money getting them to South America, Petiot took their money and killed them. They weren't the only ones to go to that house and not get what they wanted. In fact, so many people heard about this place where you could visit and then vanish that Petiot got quite the name. We don't need to tell you that he killed them all, but to others, it looked as though they'd safely escaped France. Even the Gestapo heard these rumors, with the commander saying this mysterious man had to be caught immediately. Gestapo documents that were later found noted that there was a great deal of talk in public about an organization which arranges clandestine crossings of the Spanish border by means of falsified Argentine passports. There was talk, but no one ever left Paris. Then the Nazis put a plan together to get the man. One of their agents named Robert Yotkum blackmailed a French Jew named Yvon Dreyfus. Dreyfus was told he had to find this guy and tell him he had the cash to pay for a quick exit out of France. The plan might have worked had Dreyfus ever been seen again after he talked with Petiot. He was certainly making hay while the sun didn't shine in Paris. He then killed a pregnant woman, and soon after he murdered a man named Dr. Paul Léon Braunberger, a Jew who paid Petiot for safe passage out of France. He also murdered Braunberger's wife, and Petiot did the same with 3 German Jews, all members of the Neller family. Soon after, the entire Wolf family just disappeared, as did a pimp and his mistress, Joseph Pierrechi and Josephine Aimée Grippe. More and more people went missing. These disappearances were investigated by the French, but for the Nazis, their beef was with a guy who was getting people out of France. They had no idea he was killing them, and had they known, they might not have been that bothered. He was saving them a job, not knowing they were still intent on catching him out, and so they devised a plan. In 1942, the French police started making a bunch of ugly discoveries. Body parts kept washing up from the River Seine. Heads, hands, arms, legs, and other body parts. That is, of course, because Petiot would have struggled to dump an entire body at once. It worked out well for him because it was hard to identify the bodies and not possible to link them to any murderer. Still, things were about to get quite difficult for Mr. Petiot. In 1943, his fake network was infiltrated by a Nazi collaborator named Charles Beretta. Beretta told the Nazis names of people who had applied to escape, but it seems he didn't have enough information to lead them directly to Petiot. Still, some names were enough, though. 3 of them were Raoul Fourier, Edmond Pantard, and René Gustave Nezonde. Each was arrested and taken back to Gestapo HQ to be tortured. It didn't take long for them to spill the beans, each saying they'd paid a guy named Dr. Eugène 25,000 francs for safe passage out of France. Petiot was soon arrested by the Gestapo and tortured, although it's not certain if he let the Nazis know much about what he knew about the resistance. He was then sent to prison, although it seems they had only ever found his home and not his storing and killing house on Rue de Sueur. If they had, they'd have had quite the surprise. The question is, and it did come up later, was Petiot being heroic by not speaking to the Nazis? After what you've heard today, you'd likely say no, and you'd be correct. It's assumed that the only reason he did talk is the fact that he didn't really know anything. And anyway, if he told the Nazis about what his real line of business was, they'd probably have given him a pat on the back. So, he did 8 months in prison and was released when it became obvious he had nothing to tell. Now he had the best story of all, and one which made him seem very trustworthy among enemies of the Nazis. He now had torture scars and stories of prison. Business, he thought while smiling, was about to boom. He was wrong. Very wrong. That's because on March 11, 1944, the neighbors of Petiot on the Rue de Sueur had finally had enough and went to the police saying they could no longer put up with the terrible stink coming from next door. The smell was unbearable, as if bodies were rotting in the house. They also complained about the smoke that was always billowing from the chimney. Police told the local firemen to check it out, and when they did, they found a large stove in the basement from which flames were in full flow. On inspection, they also saw that body parts were burning in the fire. They found bits and pieces of humans stored in bags and some other body parts in a quicklime pit. This was a real-life house of horrors, with enough parts to make up around 10 people. Not only that, but there were also suitcases everywhere containing the clothes of many different people. Even though this was wartime, it was still big news. France had a new madman on its hands. Petiot was now a wanted man, but let's remember that many of his friends and patients thought he was a French hero. They kind of ignored the news reports about bodies and hid Petiot thinking he was still a great doctor and a devout enemy of the evil Nazis. Petio moved around between these people, adopting new identities and doing all he could to change his appearance. If anyone asked, they told him that the only people he'd killed were informers and Nazis. This seemed true enough when he joined the French Forces of the Interior while calling himself Henri Valery. The FFI was basically the resistance in its later stage, for which Petio had played part as captain leading interrogations. His stint didn't last long since Paris was soon liberated. But again, he saw an opportunity. He was captain after all. One day, some of his men went to the house of a wealthy mayor. There, they threatened the man and called him all sorts of names, including a Nazi collaborator. They took from him 2.5 million francs and then they murdered him in cold blood. Some young folks had seen this and they went to Captain Valery, Petio, to complain. They explained about the murder and all that cash. Valery had said he'd taken care of the matter, although the men only spent a very short time behind bars. It seems the sequestered money just went missing. Only a few days later, the Resistance newspaper came out with a leading story about some killer and Nazi collaborator named Petio. The story said he was a soldier of the Reich. At the same time, police in Paris were still looking for him. Valery was even hired to look for him, so Petio was in fact looking for himself. He knew he had to get away, but he fell at the last hurdle. At precisely 10:15 a.m. on October 31st, he was recognized and arrested at a metro station in Paris. He was carrying a gun, a large amount of money, and at least 50 different documents covering a bunch of identities. In court, the defense argued that Petio had only killed enemies of France and that those bodies at the house were not his doing. Petio told the court that he'd only found out about them after his release from prison, but that they were likely the remains of collaborators killed by members of his patriotic network. He told them that he was indeed a great patriot, one of the best there was. But when stories of his bombing campaigns and killing Nazis with superweapons were investigated, it was revealed this was pure fantasy. Meanwhile, many members of the resistance said that they'd never seen him, and those that had said he'd done nothing to help them. Petio was charged with killing 27 people and raking in the realm of 200 million francs in cash, gold, and jewelry. None of this bounty was ever found. Some of the experts involved believe that Petio had murdered as many as 150 people. In the end, he admitted to killing 63 enemies of France, and as for all those missing people he hadn't killed, he said South America was a big place, and that's why those people were never found, adding that some of his victims were alive and well and just getting ready for the next war. In his psychopathic way, at one point the judge got angry with him because he wasn't paying attention and was instead doodling on some paper. He then looked up at the judge and said, "I'm listening, but it doesn't really interest me very much." When he was told he was to be executed, he didn't seem the least bit bothered. On the big day, May 25, 1946, he was said to have been very calm. He was asked if he wanted to see a priest, which he declined, stating that he wanted to take his baggage with him. A portable guillotine was then brought to the prison at around 3:30 a.m. When offered a glass of rum, which was protocol, he said no thanks, but he did take a last cigarette. His neck was shaved, his collar was cut, and his hands were tied. A witness to the execution later said he moved with ease, as though he were walking into his office for a routine appointment. His head was then placed on the machine and he uttered his last words, "Gentlemen, I ask you not to look, this will not be very pretty." At 5:05 a.m. the blade dropped, and as it did, Petio smiled for the very last time. Some people later said there was still a smile on his face as his head fell into the basket. Now you need to watch how Nazi Angel of Death finally got caught, or have a look at some of the most awful things that happened in those Nazi prisons, with the seawater torture, Nazi camp experiments,